Liberal lefty types are characterized by higher trade openness and lower conscientiousness, and then conservatives the reverse. And I think, well, that's quite interesting because it puts the liberal left types in the creative entrepreneurial domain, because that's characterized by high openness, and it puts the conservative types in the managerial and administrative domain. And so that implies that the liberal left types create new ideas and new enterprises, including entrepreneurial enterprises, because the data there is fairly solid, whereas the conservative types manage and administer those enterprises. And so each needs the other. And so there's that nice polarity dynamic. And then there's also the emergent idea that the reason that openness and conscientiousness unite to predict political behavior is because of borders. So open people like the borders between concepts to be fluid so that there's information exchange, and they're not orderly, the liberal types, because they're not conscientious, and so they don't see any utility in keeping things categorically distinct. Whereas the conservatives are afraid of the contamination of things because of the movement of information, and they like to see the borders between things to ensure that that's the case. So the reason that openness and conscientiousness stack together as predictors of political behavior seems to be because of two fundamentally different attitudes towards borders, all the way from the conceptual to the political. So the right-wingers think, well, borders are good because that stops contamination, and contamination's a real problem, and a deathly problem often. And the liberal lefty types think, no, we want as much information to flow as possible. And both of those perspectives are valid and need to be discussed. Then the other thing I learned from the empirical data was that orderliness, which is the part of conscientiousness that predicts conservatism, is associated with disgust sensitivity. And so that feeds that desire to maintain borders so that there's no cross-contamination. That's associated with what's been called the behavioral immune system. And so those are actually quite revolutionary ideas from the perspective of political theory, that the political belief is temperamentally determined, that the reason that the two temperamental traits determine political belief is because of a difference in attitude, fundamental difference in attitude towards the borders between things, that you can make a case for open and closed borders on evolutionary grounds, and that there's an association between conservatism and disgust, which to me shed tremendous light, for example, on the motivations of Hitler, who was an extraordinarily orderly person and who used disgust-oriented language all the time when he was formulating his policies of extermination. So those are revolutionary contributions of individual difference science to political theory. It's all driven by hard data, statistically derived.
Well, I agree, and I can sense the kind of paranoid reaction that these claims might elicit among some traditional political theorists and thinkers. That, are you saying that that conservative beliefs are nothing but an expression of disgust sensitivity? And of course, it doesn't apply that. These I think fascinating findings don't say that the earned income tax credit is a good or a bad idea, or the Paris Climate Accords by themselves. The issues still have to be decided on their merits. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you are aware of your own potential biases, then that is a source of insight. It's a source of understanding. It could cause you to step back from your own convictions and be more receptive to arguments on both sides. Mm-hmm. Of course,
it's definitely done that for me.
But it can't not be helpful. It can't not be an important source of insight as to how political debates unfold.
Yeah, well, if you know that the liberal left types are necessary for the fostering of new enterprises and the conservatives are necessary to run them, then that certainly indicates why both groups not only are necessary, but are of mutual benefit. Somebody has to maintain systems and someone has to expand them. And those things are going to work in opposition to one another because expanding a system often fragments it. So there's going to be tension, but no system can remain static forever. And completely untrammeled transformation throws everything into chaos. So there obviously has to be a dialogue between those two viewpoints. It's like an opponent process issue, essentially. And
yes, and all of us ought to be more aware, have more insight into how our own psychological proclivities might affect the positions that seem to each of us to be obvious.
And that is what they do, right? Because the temperamental variables actually tell you what is self-evident. That's exactly how they operate.
And my understanding from the literature that you're citing is that the variance in opinions that is correlated with innate personality differences is also the hardest to get people to give up, to persuade them of.
Yeah, well, no doubt, because I think those temperamental differences are like axiomatic values, and they're grounded in, I think they're grounded in the hyperdevelopment of separate circuitry. So it's going to be very, very, and I also think that, like, if you're an introvert and you want to learn to be an extrovert, you have to learn it micro skill by micro skill, right? There's no revolutionary cognitive transformation that's going to turn you into an extrovert. You can pick up the skills, but it's bit by bit, and it's incremental. And so I think it's the same with political attitudes, is you can develop an appreciation for the viewpoint of people who are on the other side of the temperamental divide, but it's an increment by increment advance, and it's very, very effortful. But it's necessary. It's been really useful to me to see where the cognitive, sociological, political utility of both political temperaments lies, and why it's so crucially important. With regards to disgust sensitivity, you might think, well, that's purely reductionistic with regards to the conservative viewpoint, but a lot of people in history have died as a consequence of cross-cultural contamination, right? There are estimates that up to 90%, maybe even 95% of the Native Americans perished because of their exposure to the Spaniards, right? And so the idea that contamination is a problem when two things that were distinct unite is a truism, and it's a powerful evolutionary force. And equally powerful is the observation that, well, yeah, despite that though, the benefit of information flow, free information flow and trade is so overwhelming that you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes, it's a case where the evolutionary adaptive value of a motive or of an emotion is explicable, and we can also recognize that thanks to advances in science and technology, the emotions themselves are no longer particularly effective defenses against, in this case, infection by pathogens. We have much better ways of protecting ourselves, but we are stuck with these ancient adaptations, which are no longer quite so adaptive, and indeed may even be harmful, especially when they're extended metaphorically, right, to treat other people on the metaphor of contaminants or pathogens. And you're certainly right that in Hitler's rhetoric, despite the fact that he is often claimed to have used eugenic ideas to motivate the genocide against the Jews, much more of his language came from pathology and Pasteur and microbiology. Oh yeah,
it's contempt and disgust, man. You bet. Yeah.
There was
parasites.
Parasites, exactly.
Yeah.
It's really microbiology, not genetics, that gave Hitler his toxin.